Hello. I'm basically doing my MS video to go with. I've seen lots of other people's MS videos and I found them very interesting and cool and helpful. So I thought I would do mine. It's not that different an experience that I've had with MS, but I thought I would just spend a few minutes describing my own symptoms and then maybe how my experience was different to other people. I'll highlight that as it might be more interesting. Um, I've got secondary progressive MS, which was diagnosed a couple of years ago. Previous to that, when they've tracked it all back, they think it probably started when I was 17 and I had about a year of an attack and they described it as ME. And then it must have been relapsing remitting stage, so I was okay for a few more years. Then I had another year in my mid-20s where I had what they also thought was ME, or they didn't really know what it was. And then I had another long period of remission, but with a lot of symptoms, but it was never correctly diagnosed. It really, I think, was with most MS people, it's when it gets to your eyesight that people become much more interested. And you do a lot more tests and what have you to find out what's going on, and you have the lumbar puncture and all that kind of thing. I was initially diagnosed maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I think it was, with NMO, which is different to MS, but it used to be a part of MS, and then they decided that NMO was a category on its own because of different antibodies that they talk about, but then the doctors decided it wasn't NMO, and then they decided it was secondary progressive MS. My symptoms are probably similar to what most people have experienced: numbness and tingling and difficulty walking, MS hug, and the main impact, I would say, life impact, is on eyesight, where I lost vision in both eyes, so I was registered blind, which is a rather dramatic lifestyle change over a period of years. But that was the journey I went through, where they diagnosed me into different categories of disease until somebody finally decided that it was multiple sclerosis, which again, when you look into it, the more you look into it, the deeper you go, the more you realize the little that the doctors actually know about immune system problems. My immune system obviously has reacted badly to something somewhere along the line. Nobody can really tell you what that immune system problem is, but my main the physical sign is scarring on the spinal cord, not so much on the brain, and on the eye nerve. So those are the two main characteristics that I have, that they can see evidence of something that's gone wrong. And that was why I was diagnosed with NMO initially, because they were basically depended on which doctor you talked to as to what they thought was wrong with you. At the moment, so because they said it's secondary progressive, I'm not really taking that much medication, apart from I am on a course of Chinese herbal medicine, which seems to be working quite nicely for me at the moment. I haven't had an attack in probably 3 or 4 years, due to the obvious things that you need to do, such as lifestyle change and diet. That's also very important, I think, and try to keep active and mentally try to keep quite stable, avoiding stress and all those kind of things. But my journey, I think, is not that different from when I've seen all the other MS videos. On the actual symptoms that I've had, I don't think I'm particularly different to anybody else. But what was different is probably how I experienced the initial diagnosis and my reaction to it, because I've worked as an artist most of my life. And when the main attack came, I was actually working in China. So being an artist, I decided to record my experiences in picture form, and also in words, because I also worked as a journalist, which is in this very roughly put together book that partly is, I've sort of boiled it down into this little book here. What I called it was The Dripping Rooms, because I spent a lot of time in these special rooms where you have intravenous drip. So I spent many weeks in rooms having a drip of whatever steroids or whatever concoction was thought that would be useful for me. At the end of the day, it didn't really do any good, but they were just trying everything they could. And while I was there for so long and so many hours every day, I used to take a sketchbook in with me. One of the doctors that I had encouraged me to draw in these sketchbooks. Partly I think so he could see what was going on in my mind, and also as a way of charting my eyesight to see if it was, because it was fluctuating quite a lot when you're having massive amounts of steroids pumped into your system. So then the end result was I created this short book, partly which also I recorded down all the different conversations that I had with people. So I won't go on to all the different conversations because that's also very long and boring. The first major work I did based on this experience was I created a thing called The Corridor at the End of Time, which was a 70-meter long corridor. It was 3 meter high at one end and 70 meters long and 60 centimeters high at the other end, and at the far end was a mirror, so it gave the illusion of a corridor that went on forever, which was basically how you kind of felt when you're in that hospital situation, that you're just in this endless corridor and you don't know where you're going. And people could just walk through the corridor, and it was about 400 people I think went through it on the first day. After that I'm not sure, quite a lot. So there's a photograph of the corridor when it was after it was constructed. So I had 2 long neon lights which went down, and then they were reflected again in the mirror, and the mirror was a door, so you would have to push through the mirror to get out into the other side, which was a massive room. When there was large amounts of people, I had like gallery assistants were dressed as nurses to help people through the process of going through this corridor. So a lot of people felt, I think, probably quite claustrophobic or quite scared going in through this thing. Maybe it was like a feeling of rebirth or something, I'm not sure. When they went through this corridor, they were it was probably quite a dramatic personal experience for some people. And so there's this at the bottom here is just like one of the basic sketches I did when I was sat in the hospital. Here's some action shots. So we had this, people would walk down the corridor, and that's me dressed as a nurse, and there was some other people dressed as nurses, and when they came out the other end, they came through this door where the mirror was into this large room where there was other people dressed up in suitable costumes and carrying small paintings. Okay, so while I was in hospital, like I said, the doctor encouraged me to draw things. So here I drew faces, because this, I think for me the most dramatic part was you couldn't see people's faces anymore. So I would, to express that, I just drew what I could see. Which in this case you probably can see I can't see much detail on people's faces. I just see an outline and a more of an abstract shape. So when you're talking to people, it's quite awkward, and you don't really have that much eye contact or what have you unless you're super close. these are more faces. So it's basically the eye nerve has been attacked by the immune system, so your eye nerve is not functioning properly. There's nothing wrong actually with your eyes. People always confuse that. They think there's something wrong with your eyes and say, why don't you get glasses or something like that. But actually, it's the eye nerve that is damaged. So it's a bit like the cable on a TV or something is broken, but the TV is working fine. So the signal that's going through there is I've lost central vision essentially. So I get a little bit from the peripheral vision, so I can sometimes pick up a little bit, and then I was just, that's what I just painted what I could see, partly for the doctor to sort of gauge what was going on. So that's more conversations I had with people. And while I was sitting in these rooms, I used to draw many of the other patients who were in, I was mostly in the Huashan and Huashan Hospital in Shanghai, which is probably one of the world's busiest hospitals. And I was in the emergency room most of the time because of some bureaucratic reasons. So I had to, I was basically sitting in the emergency room for probably 4 or 5 hours a day, and all these different walks of life and all these people were coming through while I was sat there having a steroid drip administered, which is very slow. So I would do drawings of the other patients and the nurses wandering around. For instance, this was an old man who was in his 90s, but he was very happy about how he'd lived to such a long age. Some people obviously were not very, because when people are in that situation, they're in quite a desperate situation. And in China, people have to pay for their medication, so people would often be debating about the prices of the medicine that they were being administered, the effectiveness. It was all sort of a long, ongoing process of debate between the medical staff and the patients. Here you can see there's basically also, most patients had family members or friends with them to help them administer the drip thing, because the nursing staff would not monitor the drip for you, because that would be an additional cost. So you were supposed to provide your own assistance on administering the drip and monitoring the drip. So for instance, this was an old lady. She had a housekeeper or something came with her, just to keep these drips going, and then alert the nurses when it ran out if they needed a new one or some other medication. In China, the habit is to administer a drip feed extremely slowly, so they could be sat there for many, many hours. And I guess if they have somebody there to help them, they're paying them by the hour to sit with them. So these are just more sketches of people. And also I would draw my kind of internal landscape of how I was feeling while I was sitting in this space. And this was obviously the feeling of, you have to be extremely patient while you're sitting there having a drip administered. It's basically just drip, 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 waiting for the bottles of medicine to finish. Obviously with my eyesight issue, I couldn't tell when it was finished. But often, usually the other patients would let me know that it was finished. Then after that period, I was admitted into the hospital. I was in hospital twice with MS. Once was in Shanghai and once was in Germany. So this book is basically about my experience in the hospital in China, which is very different to the experience in Germany. I was allowed to go into the Chinese ward of the hospital, not the foreigner ward, which was after some negotiation, but according to the law, the doctors had a big discussion and they agreed that I should be allowed into the sort of Chinese ward, which obviously the cost factor was like 1/100th of the cost of, I'm not even sure, it's probably about 30, 40 renminbi a day on the Chinese ward, and if you're in the foreigner ward, it was probably 2,000 renminbi. So I don't know what the percentage difference is between that. But and also the better doctors would only go on the Chinese ward. They didn't want to go in the other ward. So anyway, I was put in a room of the neurology department, and because I could speak Chinese and everything, they were happy to have me there, and they were very super staff there, and but it was quite a chaotic environment. So that was a drawing of, I was sat by the, my bed was by the door, and I just did a sketch of the wall next to the bed. That was a drawing I did of the door, so obviously I was trying to chart my eyesight problems, so you could see everything was incredibly broken up and no detail, and my eyesight was deteriorating. And here I was just, they had a garden in the hospital grounds, so I would sometimes go out and sit in the garden and sketch the plants and what have you. But it was right in the center of of Shanghai, which is a huge city. That's another drawing I did from the hospital bed. And the whole time I was also recording what people were saying to me. I was just writing it all down, because I didn't have any sort of computer or anything. And also because my eyesight had just gone, so I couldn't read anymore. So I was kind of entertaining myself by just using big felt tip pens and writing down what people were saying. And then later, through assistance, I managed to translate it into computer, into a Word file. So this gentleman was Dr. Chen, who was my main doctor in Huashan Hospital. He introduced himself as a humanist, and he said he's an extremely good and kind doctor who he's a research doctor who's setting up the